At the state level, there isn't great tracking. That's probably not surprising to a lot of folks in the education world and who have been covering this topic. And so the Cap Times and I really set out to answer the question, how often are educators in the state of Wisconsin being investigated for these types of complaints and this type of behavior? So we got an internal tracking sheet, which was basically just a Google spreadsheet from the state Department of Public Instruction, reviewed and coded and categorized the conduct for more than 450 misconduct investigations at the state level. And then we also put in the exact same records request to the state's 20 largest school districts by enrollment to get their internal misconduct investigation record. That was even somewhat more shocking in that we got some really high cost estimates. There were some school districts that wanted $245,000 to provide these records.
Hi, it's Alexander Russo with The Grade, and this is the Education Show, and I am so happy to be here with Cap Times all-star reporter Danielle DuClos. Danielle, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we jump into the very serious business about the series that you're writing as we speak, let's talk a little bit about who you are and where you came from. I always ask people this question. What were you like as a student? Were you the class president, the class clown? Were you not in school? You were smoking under the bleachers? What were you up to?
Definitely was very passionate about school. I was in as many clubs and AP classes as possible, and of course was a part of my high school newspaper, which is where I got my journalism start. And so, yeah, I loved school, and I think it makes a lot of sense that I started my reporting career as an education reporter, and now I do full-time investigative work, but I've also continued covering education since I do have a passion for it.
Which is great. We love it when people make progress in their career, but don't leave education entirely behind. Tell us, for people who don't know, you're a famous person to me, but maybe not to everyone else. Tell us, for people who might not know, your journalism path so far.
Yes, so I went to the the Missouri School of Journalism at the University of Missouri. And then I went straight to kind of the Gannett circle of papers and worked at the Green Bay Press Gazette straight out of college. And I was a Report for America Corps member, which was a really wonderful experience. And I covered education for about 2 years in Green Bay. And then I, about a year ago, came to the Cap Times and have been working in Madison, Wisconsin, covering all sorts of things, including educator sexual misconduct, but also police use of force and even like nursing home care quality for state-run veterans' homes. So a wide range of topics since I've come to Madison.
You don't need me to say this, but your work is great. I've really admired it, and I'm so happy that you're still writing about schools, even though the topic you're writing about right now is the most icky, awful topic that any of us can imagine. Let's talk for a second about your latest stories about what you're finding at the statewide level around enforcement and record keeping around school sexual misconduct.
Yes. So I've spent the last year digging into how the state of Wisconsin at the state level, all the way down to the district level, is tracking educator sexual misconduct and grooming complaints and how those complaints are also investigated. And so at the state level, there isn't great tracking. That's probably not surprising to a lot of folks in the education world and who have been covering this topic. And so the Cap Times and I really set out to answer the question, how often are educators in the state of Wisconsin being investigated for these types of complaints and this type of behavior? And so we got an internal tracking sheet, which was basically just a Google spreadsheet from the state Department of Public Instruction, or state education agency, and reviewed and coded and categorized the conduct for more than 450 misconduct investigations at the state level. And then we also put in the exact same records request to the state's 20 largest school districts by enrollment to get their internal misconduct investigation records. And that was even somewhat more shocking in that we got some really high cost estimates. There were some school districts that wanted $245,000 to provide these records,
Right.
from, the investigation reports to resignation agreements and settlement agreements, going back to about 2017. So that was a little eye-opening because no one really has that type of money to spend on public records.
Right. It seems like a go-away sign. The other crazy thing that you found was that people were saying we don't have any cases that respond to your requests when you knew that they had.
Yes, so that was fascinating.
Yeah.
And I think that pointed more towards their internal record keeping systems. And some of the open government advocates I spoke with about this were raising concerns that, right, I knew that they had cases because of other records I had had from the state, but other people who were just looking for these records might not know that, right? And then they would miss out on records that should have been provided. And so that was really surprising.
What's going on? I would assume that there's some mandatory record keeping requirements that schools and districts and states must operate under. What's happening? There seems like there's this reluctance to write it down.
So there is not a lot of documentation. Sometimes a lot of these investigations are happening, right? They interview people and then they do like a quick summary of what happened rather than like systematic documentation of this was the complaint. These are the people we talked to. This is the evidence we gathered. These are the determinations we came to and the findings of fact. So that's more rare. And it was often very just like a few pieces of paper, like the person's saying, I'm writing to resign from my position. And so there are like record retention requirements in the state of Wisconsin. So you have to keep records for a certain amount of time, but there aren't necessarily laws on how they need to be organized. And so some school districts just have them like paper individual files for their however many thousands of employees, which in that case, I understand it would be hard to track down those records. And some of them had half their records digitized or none of them digitized. So that adds other layers of difficulty to accessing these documents.
I used to go to this old school doctor here in New York City who was still doing the paper file thing, this big manila folder,
Right.
and they'd plop it in this little thing in the door when you came in, and then they'd look at it when you came back. Finally, the state said paper records are illegal,
Mm.
prescriptions are illegal. They just sort of forced everyone to digitize, but there was a reluctance there. And in this case, I have to say, it feels like people are scribbling things on the back of envelopes and throwing them in files. It just seems impossible.
It is very difficult to get records. And I think too, like school districts themselves don't know the reason why they wanted to charge so much or said they couldn't fulfill the request at all is that they didn't know, right? They would have to like hand inspect every single personnel file, which obviously that is not an ideal situation when you're trying to have an understanding of how often is this happening in your school district. And an attorney I spoke with at the National Women's Law Center, she said that school districts really should be tracking this to be from a prevention standpoint, right? Are there certain trainings that are needed in this school because they're seeing the same type of behaviors or complaints and investigations? And so that's a lot harder to do if you aren't tracking those documents and tracking those instances.
If you have nothing. But it also means that you don't have to take any action. How did you get involved in this topic? There are lots of education reporters who spend 5, 10, 20 years on the beat and never come near this. How did you end up finding out about this and deciding it would be something that you wanted to write about? This isn't your first time writing about this either, is it?
No, so I've been covering this almost as long as I've been covering education. And I always have thought that an education reporter is an investigative reporter, right? The education beat has so many stories that should be tackled from an accountability standpoint. And so that's really how I have approached the beat. And when I first arrived in Green Bay, there was a teacher who had been arrested and there was this high profile case going on. And I was reading about that from other news organizations. And there were a lot of questions I was left with about what had happened. How did this come to be? And so I really started investigating that just single case in the Green Bay area. And that really opened up this world of how often is this happening? How are school districts investigating these cases? How is the state tracking this? And that's really what led me to this most recent project at the Cat Times.
And what makes it interesting to you or your editors? Because again, education is so many different things. What's the I hate to use the word appeal, but what's compelling about it for you?
Yeah, I mean, education is such an important part of our society, and I really believe in the power of education. And it's really important to hold those institutions accountable, however, to that mission, right, of educating the next generation and preparing the next generation for the future. And so, obviously, people want to send their kids to school and know that they're safe. That is like the fundamental thing that you would like to assume about your schools. And that is often true, right? This is a small subset of teachers and instances. This isn't like the vast majority of instances in education, but it's really important because they have a lot of impact on kids, right? If a child is experiencing sexual harassment, grooming, or sexual assault from an educator, that is going to have drastic impacts on not only their education, but also their future relationships and just really it's very impactful. And there's not a lot of conversation about it, right? When you see this covered in the media, normally it's like episodic, right? There's one big case that's happening and then it moves on to the next thing. Then another one happens in a different community. And there's not been a lot of coverage that's looking at it systematically or from a more thematic way and like a deep investigation of how is this happening across the country or the state of Wisconsin, for example. And so that's what I really was interested is kind of answering the question of what's even going on here and how are we keeping kids safe as a state?
I couldn't agree with you more. I feel like I just feel like it's such a basic requirement to keep kids safe. And my understanding is that it's remarkably widespread, especially if you use the broadest definition of school sexual misconduct. That this is not a rare occurrence in most kids K through 12 experiences. That this is out there, much more widespread than we know. What's your sense of the extent in Wisconsin?
I wish I had a better answer to that. I honestly, we don't know even after this investigation because of the 450 plus, state license investigations that we reviewed, there was about a fifth, so around 100 cases where the internal tracking documentation by the state did not include the misconduct that was under investigation so that we could categorize it or there wasn't enough information. And so it's still an undercount, the numbers that we found in our investigation. And then again, those are just the state level investigations. Not everything reaches that, not every instance reaches that level. And so if someone remained employed, I mean, you'd really have to go to the over 420 school districts throughout the state of Wisconsin and individually ask them for their records on how often they're investigating educators or staff for this type of misconduct to get an actual true survey. And as was evident in the 20 school districts we went to ask for those records from, that was hard to find too. And then, there's of course the underreporting situation that happens with these types of, misconduct behaviors. And so there's really no true understanding of how often this is happening. But in Wisconsin, at least from the licensure investigation standpoint, we found that at least 44% of the investigations conducted by the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction had to do with educator sexual misconduct or grooming. So that's almost half. And then again, there's about that fifth where we don't even know what the conduct was.
Half of the cases where you know what the situation is. Um, the number I've seen nationally, and this is from advocates, so I can't vouch for it, but is that 1 out of 10 kids in school experiences some sort of school-based sexual misconduct. And that just seems like way too many kids. Is part of the problem that Wisconsin is one of these states that doesn't have a comprehensive law? I've talked with Matt Drange a little bit about California's efforts to improve its laws. I know that there is a federal requirement, but not much checking by the federal government, even before the current administration, about whether states were responding. Is Wisconsin one of the states that has an incomplete law?
So we are one of the states that has criminalized educator sexual misconduct. So that is something that went into effect about a year ago, and that is a step in the right direction. But there are definitely gaps in the current policies and the state statutes. And so one thing that there was a recent legislative informational hearing in the Capitol here in Madison last week in response to my reporting, and they brought in law enforcement to talk about some gaps in that educator sexual misconduct statute that makes it a crime. And the law enforcement brought up that there's certain wording in the statute that requires the teacher and the student to be at the same school, which is very limiting. And if that, student goes from middle school to high school and then that teacher is still grooming that student, that law wouldn't necessarily apply, is what those law enforcement officers were saying. And so there's definitely, even though we've made some progress, there's obviously some issues with some of the state statutes. And there's also some lacking in specificity in terms of, I think the federal law that you were talking about is like preventing aiding and abetting of educators to get jobs who are suspected of engaging in, sex crimes against children. And in Wisconsin, there isn't necessarily a lot of definition behind that. They just kind of copied and pasted the Every Student Succeeds Act language. And there's also a caveat that if that complaint or that report had been referred to law enforcement and didn't result in a criminal charge, that it doesn't apply. So there is no prohibition on helping that person get a new job. So that's an interesting caveat that's written into our state statute currently.
So someone can resign or move to another district and not be caught in the net of the federal requirements as implemented in Wisconsin.
If it was referred to law enforcement and then there was no criminal charge. And as I'm sure you know, these cases are very hard to prosecute. And so that is a possibility. That is a gap in the current state statute, yes.
What's the response been to the series that you're doing now in the newsroom, among readers, other outlets, public officials? What kind of a vibe are you getting?
It's been very overwhelming, actually. And, every time a reporter covers something, you just hope that people read it and it starts a conversation. And that's definitely happening here in Wisconsin. I'm about a day or two after the first article in the series published. State lawmaker said she was drafting legislation in response to the reporting. There's already been a legislative informational hearing held in the state assembly. There's one scheduled for next week in the state senate. And then there's also a proposed audit of the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction's investigation practices by our nonpartisan audit bureau that would conduct that. And so there's been a lot of response, even just from direct impact in terms of lawmakers responding and lots of people calling and emailing. And that's always, it's just great to see people reading and talking about something that obviously is very important.
And are other outlets around the state picking up or piggybacking on the story, or are they just letting you have it on your own?
So there have been, I calculated it yesterday, about, over 20 other news articles written about this topic, particularly as the legislative hearing that happened last week and some of the lawmakers' response. And so it's been interesting to see other news outlets talk about this. And ultimately, a lot of this is not covered. You mentioned that, right? Like people can spend a decade on this beat and not cover this topic. And so I think that's the real highlight there, is that it's starting a conversation and this is now being talked about widely and in the open.
What's it like spending so much time on this topic? It must be satisfying to do the work and have it responded to so thoroughly, but I'm guessing that it's not all fun.
Yeah, I think fun is definitely not the word I would use to describe doing this type of work. And I think there's a reason why people don't want to cover it, right? It's hard to cover. It's hard to get access to this information. And it's also really dark and really heavy and disturbing things to cover, right? And it is something that you really have to think about too when covering it. I have to be really careful about the way that I'm covering it and ensuring that I kind of have boundaries up around that, because when you spend a year reading about children who have been sexually harassed, assaulted, groomed, or experiencing these really horrible things, it can take the toll.
What's the I can imagine, and I'm glad you're tracking that and protecting yourself. But what's the difference? I think I know the answer to this, but you're actually living this experience. Journalists are known for liking bad news, car accidents, crimes, embezzlement. If it bleeds, it leads, right? This is the mantra of this great and awful industry that we're in. What's the difference between covering a war or a political conflict and covering this kind of thing in schools? Can you tease out why it's darker or different?
Yeah, I don't have experience covering like war conflicts like that, but I think people can see how children are some of the most vulnerable people in our society, right? And they're held up as, right, the future, the next generation. And when someone's so vulnerable, and I think, in terms of coverage in general in journalism, we tend to cover those who don't have a voice, right? And try to highlight the folks who are not having their perspectives maybe shared. And so children are, in education particularly, they're hard to highlight, right? To get them involved in as sources in general. And this topic it's dark and it's heavy because children should be having, right? Like playing outside and enjoying school and being happy. And that is the case a lot of the time. But when this type of conduct happens, it's very damaging to them, and not just to the child, but to their family, to the school community, to the larger community of a city, right? It's very
Yeah, it's
impactful.
devastating.
Yeah,
In addition to the vulnerability of the kids, I think it's deeply, deeply unpleasant, as much or more for an education reporter, to think about uh, an adult, a teacher, someone on staff, a coach, abusing that authority. I think it's just a very disturbing thing to think about both the perpetrator and the survivor. That's my sense of part of what's going on. And when I talk to journalists who've written these stories, people they tell me that the responses they get are either "Yeah, that happened to me," or "That happened in my school," or "I know someone like that," or "That would never happen here. Our teachers are so
right.
upstanding and kind and generous," as most of them are.
Yeah, and I've gotten some of that myself, both ends of the spectrum, right? Like, this has happened to me. Thank you for highlighting this issue, and I've experienced that. And then also, people who feel the other way, right? That this would not happen here, or things like that. And I think that's because schools hold a really powerful place in a community, right? People feel very connected to their schools, particularly like if you went to that school and now your kids go to that school and you know the teachers and you send your kid there and they're there all day long. And so people have a really strong tie to their community schools, and I think that's why this issue cuts so deep for folks.
What do you plan to do next? I know this is a series. Hope it's ongoing. What's the next step for you in the investigation?
Yeah, so we already kind of talked about this a little bit, but the states that have good policies and then what Wisconsin is missing, and kind of looking at the gaps in our current laws and ways that Wisconsin could adopt practices from other states, whether that's Florida, which has a little bit more access to these records publicly, or if it's like Arizona, which puts out annual reports on its the State Department statistics on how many investigations is conducted, types of conduct that was investigated, and things like that. So that's on the docket. And then, of course, we'll be covering everything as it unfolds in the state capitol and elsewhere.
Does your scope include student on student school sexual misconduct? There was a TV show. This is more about violence than about sexual assault, but there's a TV show last year called Adolescence, which is about the radicalization of boys and the hyper misogyny that some boys absorb from these online male influencers. And I hear about boys in class towards students and also towards female teachers um, uh, saying and doing things that seem hard to imagine. Are you including students in your scope, or are you mostly just looking at adult on student?
I've solely been looking at adult on student conduct and that of staff. So that is definitely another subset of this topic, and but my reporting hasn't touched on that.
And then I feel like there's a little club. I think of you as K-pop demon hunters of school sexual assault journalism. Um,
Interesting. Okay.
who else is out there doing this work that you talk to or admire? Do you have a secret clubhouse and some songs?
I'm definitely not as official as maybe you're making it sound, but yeah, Matt Drange and I have known each other for a couple years and found each other organically while covering this topic. And he's obviously been doing a lot of really great work on this. You mentioned the California legislative changes that are happening as a result of his reporting, which is really great to see. And there is like episodic coverage across the country. I know Cal Matters has been doing work on this as well. And so there's definitely everyone can do this, right? This is reporting that should be part of every single education reporter's beat. This should just be something, a records request that you put in every year to your school districts. What investigations have you conducted, and to look at those? And I think that that's just a routine thing that should become a part of the education beat because of how important child safety is.
And if I'm an educational reporter and I'm interested in learning more about how to cover this topic, I call and bother you, obviously, and I call and bother Matt. Is there anybody else, a journalist, academic, an author? Is there anyone else who's on this topic?
Yeah, so there are a lot of people who have really dedicated much of their lives and their professional careers to studying educator sexual misconduct. So Dr. Cheryl Shakeshaft is an incredible resource. She's written a book called Organizational Betrayal that really I highly recommend reading. It really breaks down the prevalence of this issue, how it happens, and then also prevention and solutions, which I think is a very important part of when you're covering this topic, is to look at what policies and what changes can be made in your state or school district to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Um, Dr. Billy Joe Grant is also a really incredible researcher who covers this. She's also a misconduct prevention trainer, so she has that prevention and solutions oriented mindset as well. And then the Sesame Group, which is Stop Educator Sexual Misconduct Exploit. Oh, I might be messing up that acronym, but it's the Sesame Group, and they are advocates and a group of researchers and folks who advocate to stop educator sexual misconduct and exploitation of children in schools. And then Enough Abuse is also an advocacy organization that tracks legislation really well. And so if you're interested at what your laws are in your state, that's a group to go to look at.
Excellent. One last question, and thank you so much for doing this, for the work, and for laying it all out here so that other journalists and educators and advocates can learn more about it. Is there anything that you've done or maybe did at the beginning of your reporting journey on this topic? You mentioned doing the FOIAs about investigations, right? That sounds like something that you highly recommend for people to do. Is there anything that you did that ended up being not as effective or not as important that people might understandably start with, but maybe should skip? Any other lessons learned, hard-won lessons learned from doing this for as many years as you've done it now?
Yeah, I think that before filing your records request, doing a phone call with your school district to learn how they're organizing their records, right? I think that is a really key part of being successful and understanding how school districts are conducting these investigations and how they're documenting them. And that will ensure that you'll be able to get actual records instead of them charging you maybe a bunch of money or saying that they can't fulfill it. And so having that conversation, I think, is really helpful. And then it will also help you in your reporting. Yeah.
Rather than just lobbing the request over and
Mhm.
assuming that they'll figure it out, is there an officer or a person assigned in every school district to be a point on this, whether or not they'll talk to you? Is there an IG? I'm sure some small districts don't have an in-house inspector general. Who's the person that you're going to want to talk to if they'll talk to you?
Right. So whoever, every state has different public records laws, but whoever is the person that one would be fulfilling your public records request is a good person to talk to. But also, whoever runs human resources in your school district is someone you'll want to talk to because they're usually the person who's conducting these investigations in most school districts. And maybe that's not the quote unquote human resources person. Maybe it's the superintendent, maybe it's the assistant superintendent, or maybe it's the principal. But whoever would be the one that you think would actually be conducting the investigation is the person you probably want to talk to because they're going to know what records they're creating and how the school district approaches these types of topics. But it might take some time to build those relationships because obviously this is a really sensitive topic and it's hard to get people to talk to you about it.
But just in terms of knowing who you'd like to be talking to or that there is a person, this is an embarrassing question. I should know, but I don't. Is Title IX involved here? Is there a Title IX officer in every school district in America, or was there?
There should be, yes. So Title IX, that is definitely a way to go about it, is asking for Title IX records. That didn't turn out to be as lucrative for me in terms of getting records. There was a lot of investigations that probably could have fallen under Title IX that were not. So I think including that language in your records request is important, but maybe couching it as regardless of whether Title IX applied or you conducted a Title IX investigation, because that can be a way school districts will then very narrowly tailor to provide you just some records. But a lot of these investigations are just being conducted as personnel investigations for violating maybe school policy on sexual harassment or appropriate boundaries or things like that. And so casting a broad net is very important. But yes, talking to the Title IX coordinator might be a good place to start as well to see if they're truly categorizing every single one of these types of investigations as a Title IX investigation or not.
This is amazing and so important. Danielle DuClos from Cap Times, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you. I really appreciate being here. Thanks.